The entrance of Curtis 50 Cent Jackson into the courtroom sent a ripple through everyone present, not with noise but with the weight of significance. He didn't have to speak or even glance at the cameras. His arrival was declaration enough. Every seated observer, from reporters to legal staff, turned their focus sharply to the man who once dominated charts and now walked silently into a courtroom charged with tension. Dressed with intent, his presence gave the space a sharp edge, like a blade that had finally been unsheathed. No words passed his lips, but every step was calculated, an intentional message to the one sitting across the room. It wasn't just about showing up, it was about staking territory in a legal storm that had become too big to ignore. Diddy, sitting quietly with his legal representatives, didn't react immediately, but something in his posture shifted. He knew the stakes, both legal and reputational, had just been raised. Across decades of rivalry, this was the most potent move yet, not crafted in lyrics but in legal symbolism. For years there had been jabs, cryptic social media posts, and business maneuvers that hinted at discord between these two titans. But this wasn't a moment rooted in ego or industry competition. This was personal. And the courtroom wasn't a stage for spectacle, but a battleground for truth. Jackson's decision to show up was more than a visit, it was a reckoning. Observers whispered as they watched, unsure whether to look at the judge, the defendant, or the unannounced guest who had turned the day's proceedings into a landmark moment. No one had expected this turn, not even those closest to the case. Even the defense team seemed to hesitate, recalibrating their next steps while side-eyeing the new presence in the room. What stood out was the restraint. Jackson didn't flinch, didn't nod, didn't break composure. His face offered nothing, yet it said everything, that the unwritten codes of silence within powerful circles were beginning to fracture. It wasn't just an appearance, it was an indictment of everything that had gone unspoken. The courtroom had been filled with tension from the beginning, but now it was layered with history, a history shared between two men who had once navigated the same stages and studios, now placed on opposite sides of morality. Diddy didn't need to hear any accusation aloud. The context was loud enough. That hallway, once neutral territory, had now become a minefield of implications. Every camera outside the courtroom had missed this development until someone inside leaked the image. Curtis Jackson sitting calmly, eyes forward, hands resting quietly. Social media exploded within minutes, with hashtags flooding timelines and pundits scrambling for new narratives. No caption was needed, because the moment told its own story that accountability might be catching up. The silence between the two men spoke louder than any confrontation. This wasn't a feud reignited, it was a collision between memory and consequence. There was something poetic in how no words had been exchanged, yet everything felt said. Those watching closely noticed how even the prosecution adjusted their demeanor, subtly aware that the dynamics had shifted. A case that once relied on depositions and timelines now had a symbolic weight, carried by the presence of someone who had once been dismissed as merely an agitator. But this wasn't provocation, it was a call for scrutiny. Rumors had swirled for years about misconduct in music's upper echelons, often brushed aside or minimized by influence and spin. But when a figure like 50 Cent sat down silently in a courtroom filled with whispers, it added gravity that even the most skeptical observer couldn't ignore. His involvement was no longer speculative, it was intentional, possibly even tactical. The defense struggled to maintain focus as they cross-examined witnesses, their arguments suddenly under a more intense microscope. No longer was this just about clearing a name, it had become a matter of confronting a legacy built on curated perception. The shift in atmosphere was palpable, every word now measured against a new standard of scrutiny. Backroom discussions turned frantic, with aides and legal advisors exchanging worried glances and whispered what-ifs. What if he was there to testify? What if more public figures followed his lead and turned up not for drama, but for clarity? Jackson's presence sparked a new round of discussions both inside and outside the courthouse. Conversations not just about guilt or innocence, but about complicity, culture, and whether silence is ever truly neutral. He didn't bring evidence, he brought pressure, and in cases like these, pressure often reveals what evidence alone cannot. As the proceedings carried on, no one could deny the psychological effect his presence had on everyone involved. Even jurors instructed to remain impartial were human. They noticed, they absorbed, the entire room felt as though it had tilted, just slightly but enough to change balance. The press coverage pivoted almost instantly, recentering the story not just around allegations but around a shifting culture where alliances, history and reputation were all under the microscope. What had been a methodical legal process was now infused with urgency. Suddenly, this wasn't just about law, it was about legacy. The broader industry took note too. Executives, artists, insiders. They watched carefully, understanding that the traditional playbook of silence and settlement was beginning to wear thin. Curtis Jackson had opened a door that might not easily close again. His appearance suggested there was more coming, possibly more names, more stories, more uncomfortable truths. It hinted at a domino effect that could stretch beyond the courtroom and into boardrooms, studios and partnerships built on unspoken understandings. And for the first time those understandings were being questioned in public. People often expect dramatic gestures in moments like these, but it was the restraint that made it powerful. There were no interruptions, no statements to the press, no grand gestures. It was the stillness that made the moment quake. Every detail of that day would be dissected. What time he arrived, how long he stayed, what he wore, where he sat. And yet, none of that would define the moment more than the look that passed between the two men. Not anger, not fear, just a shared understanding that something irreversible had begun. The courtroom continued its schedule, witness after witness, legal point after legal point. But everyone knew the case had changed the moment he walked in. No matter how the trial played out, the court of public opinion had a new chapter. Curtis Jackson didn't testify. He didn't need to. His mere presence spoke volumes in a space where truth had long been manipulated, massaged and monetized. What happened next would unfold in time, but the tone had been set. And in a world where timing is everything, he had chosen his moment with surgical precision. One appearance, no words, and everything changed. The air was thick with anticipation. Yesterday had ended with a shockwave and today promised impact. The courtroom, still echoing with the silent statement made by 50 Cent's appearance, now braced for something louder. Words. From the witness list, one name had been circled, whispered about, debated over. It wasn't a celebrity, not a mogul, but someone with proximity, someone who had seen too much and remained silent for too long. When she stepped forward, it wasn't with dramatics. She walked slowly, with the kind of calm that only comes from finally shedding the weight of fear. Her name had never been on magazine covers, but today, every headline would carry it. She raised her right hand, took the oath and sat down. The prosecution leaned in. The defense shifted, uneasy. And then she spoke. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone's life," she began. "I came here to tell the truth, because it's long overdue." It wasn't the kind of bombshell that exploded with fury. It was the kind that built layer by layer, carefully, painfully, and with precision. Her words painted a picture that couldn't be unseen. For over a decade she had worked within the machinery of an empire that appeared untouchable. Luxury, fame, success, that's what the public saw. But behind closed doors she described something darker. Contracts manipulated, people silenced, abuse dismissed. She spoke of private gatherings with strict rules, of employees forced into silence, of colleagues who left their careers behind just to escape. It wasn't hearsay. She named names. She provided dates. And when asked why she hadn't spoken earlier, her voice cracked. "Because I was scared. Because nobody listened until now." As she described one incident, a gathering at a luxury estate that ended in threats and intimidation, the room held its breath. She didn't embellish. She didn't speculate. She just reported, like someone finally releasing years of burden. The judge leaned forward, attentive. The jury scribbled notes, visibly rattled. And across the aisle, Diddy sat motionless, his lawyers whispering frantically beside him. It was no longer about denials. This was testimony backed by detail, and more importantly, by corroborating evidence. Visual, Exhibit A shown in court. A series of internal messages, text exchanges from years past, flashed across the screen. In one, she pleaded with a superior to stop a particular event from happening again. In another, she was threatened with termination for overstepping. Suddenly, her words were no longer just stories, they were a record. "She didn't just tell a story, she verified it," said one legal analyst watching from the media room. "This wasn't a he said, she said, this was he did, and here's the digital footprint to prove it." Every new detail she offered tightened the prosecution's grip. It wasn't about painting Diddy as a villain. It was about revealing the cracks in an empire that had long relied on silence, reputation and power. When someone speaks truth to power, the room always changes. But when that truth is supported by evidence, backed by lived experience and presented without vengeance, it becomes something bigger. It becomes impossible to ignore. Her testimony stretched for hours, interrupted only by breaks requested by the defense. They tried to trip her up. They challenged her memory. They attempted to frame her as bitter, as someone with an agenda. She didn't flinch. "I didn't gain anything by coming here," she responded calmly. "In fact, I've lost a lot. But if staying quiet helped protect people who hurt others, then I was part of the problem. I'm done with that. This wasn't just a witness. This was a reckoning. A moment where someone from inside the fortress tore down the curtains, not out of revenge, but out of responsibility. And that's what made it so powerful. Reporters scrambled to summarize the morning's bombshells. Security doubled. Supporters and critics of the accused chanted outside. The world beyond the courtroom had finally realized what was happening inside. Even fellow industry insiders, many of whom had stayed silent for years, began speaking out on social media, subtly at first, then more openly. It's not just one story. One tweet read, "It's the story behind the stories." And they were right. What this woman shared was not a random grievance. It was a map, a blueprint of how power, when unchecked, festers into exploitation. As she stood to leave the witness box, a hush fell over the courtroom. Even the judge offered a rare nod of acknowledgement, not approval but respect. Diddy didn't look at her. She didn't look back. Because this wasn't about confrontation, it was about clarity. And with that, the wall began to crumble. Because when someone finally says the truth aloud, not whispered, not theorized, but sworn into the record, everything built on denial starts to collapse. One testimony became a gateway. Suddenly, more were willing to come forward. More names appeared on witness lists. More subpoenas were issued. The empire, once built on status and secrecy, now faced what it feared most, exposure. And the person who started that avalanche. She wasn't a star. She wasn't a billionaire. She was someone who saw too much, and finally said enough. The witness walking away from the courthouse into a crowd of reporters. The defense team huddled in strategy meetings. 50 Cent, still silent, exiting a side door, cameras flashing. Headlines, key witness speaks out. Testimony could shift entire trial. Industry insider breaks code of silence. Some stories collapse under scrutiny. Others survive it. But the truth? It doesn't need survival. It just needs to be spoken. And in that courtroom, on that day, it finally was. When the initial wave of media coverage settled, what remained was the undeniable resolve of a woman who chose to reclaim her story. Cassie, long portrayed through headlines and whispers, stepped forward to speak not from a place of vengeance but from a determination to be heard. It wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a message to every person still trapped in silence. For years, Cassie's image had been curated, shaped by others, and marketed to fit someone else's narrative. But the mask cracked when she laid bare a truth few in the public ever imagined. Her decision to expose what went on behind closed doors shook the carefully maintained illusions surrounding a man the world thought it knew. She detailed manipulation dressed as mentorship, control camouflaged as care, and isolation masked as protection. Through legal documents and personal testimony, a picture began to emerge, not of a spoiled romance, but of a pattern. And for the first time, Cassie was in control of how her story was told. She didn't ask for pity, nor did she try to play the role of the hero. Her strength lay in her vulnerability, her bravery in choosing to revisit a past most would bury. In doing so, she turned pain into purpose, and broke open a larger conversation around fame, power, and coercion. Public reactions were divided, but one thing became clear. Cassie was no longer willing to be anyone's silence. She had become a voice not just for herself, but for others who recognized themselves in her words. Each statement she released echoed far beyond celebrity gossip. It rang through communities tired of seeing survivors ignored. The lawsuit wasn't just about legal accountability, it was a cultural awakening. It called out the normalization of control in relationships where one person holds all the cards. Cassie's choice to speak disrupted a system that profits from silence. She laid out experiences that, while personal, painted a broader picture of how abuse can exist within glitz and glamour. Behind the flashing lights and chart-topping music, there was another world, one of secrecy, fear, and manipulation. Cassie invited the world to look past the fame and see the human cost. Even as critics tried to discredit her or twist her intentions, she stood firm. Every accusation hurled her way only confirmed why so many victims never come forward. But Cassie didn't back down. Her courage amplified the voices of those too afraid to speak. Her words gave others the language to describe what they had endured. Online, survivors rallied behind her, sharing stories they had hidden for years. Cassie's choice to go public created a ripple effect, one that extended far beyond the courtroom. For decades, pop culture has celebrated stories of redemption and resilience, but rarely do we see what that transformation costs. Cassie laid it bare. The therapy, the fear, the anxiety of being disbelieved. Her vulnerability became a catalyst for hard, necessary conversation. Comes with consequences. But despite that, she chose to continue, not because it was easy, but because it was right. In interviews she remained composed, but her eyes told a deeper story. The weight of years spent internalizing pain couldn't be erased overnight, yet in her stillness there was undeniable strength, the kind that doesn't need validation to exist. Her battle was never just with one person. It was against a culture that normalizes harm when it's hidden behind luxury. By lifting the curtain, Cassie forced a reckoning that stretched across the entertainment industry and beyond. It challenged the idea that wealth and fame can excuse any behavior. Through it all, she never pretended to be perfect. She acknowledged her past decisions, the way she had been complicit in her own silence, but rather than shame she offered honesty, and in that honesty others found relief. People often forget that healing is not linear. Cassie's journey wasn't about instant resolution, but about reclaiming ownership over her life, and by doing so she paved a path for others who felt lost in their trauma. The impact of her actions reached far beyond headlines and trending topics. Cassie shifted the narrative from scandal to survival, and perhaps most importantly, she showed that even after years of being silenced, it's never too late to speak. She reminded everyone watching that telling your truth doesn't require approval, that it's okay to be afraid and still move forward, that real power lies in refusing to be controlled. Cassie's story will not be defined by her pain, but by her decision to rise from it. She didn't just reclaim her voice, she offered it as a bridge for others to find their own. And that, more than anything, is what makes her stand unforgettable. When accusations turn into headlines and silence becomes a roar, even the highest towers begin to tremble. The world watched as a once untouchable mogul faced the kind of scrutiny that money and influence can't always outmaneuver. It wasn't just a personal reckoning, it was the unmasking of a legacy built on power dynamics long ignored. Corporate sponsors distanced themselves, long-time collaborators went quiet, and past associates suddenly had something to say. The very networks and platforms that once elevated his image began quietly deleting content and reassessing deals. The empire that had appeared invincible was showing cracks under the weight of accountability. What was once celebrated as entrepreneurial genius now drew side eyes and caution. People began revisiting old interviews, lyrics and public interactions with a new lens. What had been hidden in plain sight was now being re-examined and re-evaluated. Lawsuits weren't the only threat. The court of public opinion proved just as fierce and far-reaching. Online discourse shifted from speculation to deeper conversations about consent, control, and unchecked influence. It was a domino effect. Allegations against one man ignited curiosity about others, who operated in similar spaces. Suddenly, the industry's silence was no longer viewed as professionalism. It was complicity. Other victims began coming forward, some anonymously, others bravely sharing their truths. These stories were not new, but they were finally being heard. The cultural climate had shifted. People were now listening and demanding change. Brands that had once clamored to be associated with the mogul now scrambled to distance themselves. Strategic statements filled with vague concern replaced glowing endorsements. The damage wasn't just to reputation, it was financial, legal, and cultural. As settlements and investigations mounted, the empire once rooted in bravado and dominance started to feel more like a crumbling monument to outdated values. Suddenly, longevity in the industry didn't mean immunity. It meant years of unanswered questions catching up. No matter how long the history, no one is above accountability. Suddenly, longevity in the industry didn't mean immunity. It meant years of unanswered questions catching up. No matter how long the history, no one is above accountability. This wasn't just a fall from grace, it was a shift in narrative. Power once used to shape culture was now being used to shield from it. But times had changed, and the audience had evolved. Fans who once idolized the empire's reach began distancing themselves, questioning their loyalty to the music, the brand, and the man behind it all. The question wasn't just, did he do it? It became, how did we not see it? Reflection became as widespread as reaction. Some defenders remained vocal, but even their numbers began to dwindle as more information surfaced. Legal documents, depositions, and first-hand accounts painted a picture that could no longer be dismissed. The wall of denial was weakening with each detail revealed. With every cancellation and contract terminated, the message grew louder. Influence is not an excuse. Cultural icons are not exempt from consequences. What had once been whispered backstage was now broadcast to the world. From the outside it looked like a rapid downfall, but in truth it was the result of years, perhaps decades, of buried truths finally coming to light. The empire wasn't destroyed overnight, it simply collapsed when people stopped pretending not to see the fire. Silence, it turns out, is combustible. The more it's suppressed, the louder it explodes when finally released. And this explosion shook the foundations of an entire industry. There were no more comfortable illusions. People began demanding transparency from those who once thrived behind the scenes. The notion of untouchability was shattered. A reckoning had arrived, and it wasn't just personal, it was systemic. The entertainment world was now forced to confront how often it enabled harm under the guise of loyalty or legacy. Survivors were no longer just voices in the background, they were leading the chorus. It became clear, if a kingdom is built on fear and silence, it is doomed to fall. No amount of accolades can protect a reputation when the truth demands to be heard, and no amount of revision can rewrite what is now known. But amid the collapse, something else rose, a renewed sense of responsibility in media, music and culture. There was a call to do better, to protect people over profits. It was messy, long overdue, but absolutely necessary. The legacy of the mogul, once meticulously crafted and tightly managed, will now forever be split into two chapters, before the truth and after it. And in this second chapter, the voices that were once silenced are finally at the forefront. This is the new reality, one where truth reshapes even the most powerful empires. And while the headlines will eventually fade, the impact of this cultural shift will linger. It's a moment that reminded everyone watching that no brand, no name, no amount of fame is beyond the reach of accountability. The fall may be personal, but the message is universal. So what happens now? The world moves forward, but with new eyes. A changed audience, a shaken industry, and a lesson that will echo for years to come. If you found this story compelling and want to stay updated on the voices, stories and truths reshaping our culture, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to hit the notification bell below, that way you won't miss the next chapter in our deep dive series. Because in a world full of noise, we're here to bring you the truth that matters.